Thank you so much, Dr. Marc Carpenter, for being here with us. Your book, The War on Ilahee, focuses on the pioneer Northwest in the mid 1850s. But before we narrow in on that interesting time period, exciting is not the right word. Before we narrow in on that, could you maybe sketch the broader American story of genocide and Native peoples in America? I mean, assuming our audience just knows nothing, what's the big historical picture here?
Sure. So I think the place I'd start with the big historical picture is to remember that there is nowhere in the Americas, North or South America, that was empty land, right? I think that's an old myth that has a lot of weight behind it, right? But everywhere that is now the US, Canada, Mexico, Belize, wherever, right, was native land first and then was taken by European and then by American powers. So very broadly, right, we're talking the United States, there was a steady push across political parties, across the political spectrum in the late 1700s, throughout the 1800s, to take as much native land as possible, as expeditiously as possible. So the most common way would be by making treaties with native nations, saying we sign over this land to us. But as you would expect, and something that sometimes gets forgotten, no country just says, oh yeah, we'd love to give up a bunch of our land, right? All of those treaties came with the threat of force, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. And frequently those treaties came with sign over your land to us, or we won't stop the people from our country who are going to come over and murder you, or sign over your land to us, or we will exterminate you. And so the role of genocide has a technical definition. It's got a legal definition. It's one of a series of acts, murders, inflictions of qualities of life likely to create death, forcible transfer of children, prevention of births. If those are done with the intent to destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group in whole or in part, those are acts of genocide. And over again, from before the beginning of the United States throughout the first 120 years of the United States, there are calls for genocide from U.S. officials, from U.S. military figures, and from Americans on the ground who say, we are going to exterminate this group of people, or we're going to exterminate all Indians, right? And if you make a call to exterminate a group, and then because of that call, you kill members of that group, that is an act of genocide. So the way it's often talked about in the field, and your listeners might also look to Jeffrey Osler's Surviving Genocide, which I think is a major kind of landmark book in reconfiguring, kind of noting how common genocide is in American history, right? Genocide is a policy option throughout the US. So there's almost never a time where the whole of the US government says, yes, we're going to go do genocide, but there's frequently times where genocide is one of the tools being used to get land from Native communities. And that goes steadily across every attempt to seize land, right? From, again, the beginning of the Constitution, one of the first things are threats of extermination to seize the land in the Old Northwest. And that continues through to the period that is the focus of my book, the attempts to seize the area that are now Oregon and Washington in the late 1840s, early 1850s, which were often genocidal. Notably, it can come from above. It can be orders from above. And at least a couple times in my book, it was, from the local governors, right? But it can also come from below, right? It doesn't have to come from the government. And frequently, one of the things I try to dig into is just how often people from below, everyday people and pioneers, were calling for genocide and then committing acts of violence, which therefore count as genocide.
Awesome. That's a broad overview, and right, you have to speak in generalities, but in your book, you focus in on this Northwest War in particular.
Yeah.
Can you tell us how much of that just corresponds to the picture you've just painted? Were there any unique things that you picked out in this book? Give us a more specific view here.
Sure. Yeah. So in many ways, this was a continuation of earlier policy. In fact, many of the people who took part in what I'm calling the War on Ilahee, this often genocidal war between the end of the 1840s through the 1860s, right, saw themselves as fighting in a new version of the same war their parents and grandparents had been fighting. They called back to how their grandparents and grandparents had seized native land in Kentucky or in Illinois, or especially in Florida, right? So that part was kind of in keeping with broader norms. A few things were a little bit different about these periods. One of them was there's a much more accelerated push to the far west in this period. Probably the famous one is the California Gold Rush. And presently, before my book, the big famous genocidal period in U.S. history, the largest one that's been proven is in California, right? but also a thing called the Donation Land Claim Act, where the U.S. promised huge tracts of free land to settlers who would come over to what's now Oregon and Washington, brought enormous numbers of people very quickly, and then drawing on those older traditions, they rushed into genocidal war, often even more quickly than had been the case previously. And kind of the ends of that war, the beginnings of the peak period of genocide in the U.S., the 1850s and 1860s, it seems to have been kind of more broadly common across U.S. lands than it had been previously. I think the other big thing that I would want to throw in that's a little bit different about the Pacific Northwest is the extent of the cover-up, not only of the genocide, but even of the violence. As Oregon and Washington kind of changed their sense of themselves, and particularly as they were appealing to the federal government for certain kinds of money, as the generations changed, there was more and more of a focus on a history of that place as peacemaking. So by the 1930s, the wars that I talk about were marginal at best in narratives of the history of both places. And the kind of everyday mainstream sense of them is that it's a place where there was comparatively less violence, which is really starkly at odds with the actual history of what happened in the 1850s and 1860s.
So, I mean, the temptation I think I have, and a lot of people have, when they hear these sort of narratives and stories, is to say, well, of course. And you know, I think a lot of people have come to terms with, okay, we did some bad things in the past. But then we tend to say, but those were some bad apples in a broader tree that's healthy and whole. And of course, there's always those people. But in your book, the interesting thing that you state, and this is a quote, you state almost all Northwest pioneers of the 1850s were complicit in genocide. What do you mean by complicit? And what led you to this sort of, I mean, this very provocative conclusion that it's not just a few, but it's almost everyone?
Yeah. So I'll take that in parts. I think you're absolutely right. One of the responses to any story of horror, particularly in one's own country, right, is often to try and isolate it, right? To say that's just a few people at the edges of it, right? To try and make it an aberration rather than a structure. Part of the research for this book that I did, part of what I think makes it different from a lot of previous histories of these wars, is really digging into the papers of everyday people, right? Getting to literally hundreds of pioneers and kind of their thoughts and their reasons for participation, and showing a broad-based norm of support for genocide, right? Where whole towns would show up and call for mass killings. There's a particularly chilling moment in Vancouver, Washington, where a military commander has done what his supposed job was and negotiated to imprison an entire Native community, and he is shamed by the men and the women of Vancouver for not just murdering all of them. Right? He's given a dress as like an insult because he should have come back with blood on his sword, right? And they'll have a lot of talk about, you know, making the white flags and the white dresses red with the blood, right? There are routine calls for mass murder. So that's a part of it, right? That's a community base, right? It's also the case when we talk about complicity, right? That means that you are indirectly part of a crime, right? That you are allowing it to go. And usually when we talk about complicity, it comes with the notion that if a crime is being done that will profit you and you know it's happening and you don't do something to try and stop it or alert people, then you are complicit in it. That's how we typically define it criminally, right? And it is widely known among the pioneers who came that the land they were going to belonged to Native people, and it is widely supported that that land be taken away by force if necessary. And again, outright endorsement of genocide is very, very frequent, and knowledge that genocide is the thing that is profiting those pioneers is routine. Right? There are exceptions. Again, I say almost all deliberately, right? There are people who push against it, but the norm, if you came in that period, was to know you were coming to take land from another people and to know and often support the level of violence that would be done to do that.
So in the book, you use the term settler colonial sin eaters. What the heck is that? I want to make sure I got that right. Is settler colonial sin eaters? That's fun. What is it?
Yeah. Let's break it down into its component parts, and we'll see if it catches on for anybody beyond me. So settler colonialism is a theory that talks about the form of colonialism that is seeking to take land and remove, exclude, or exterminate the people who live on it, right? So it's a way we differentiate between a colonialism that attempts to create a permanent racial underclass in the place that you're invading, and a colonialism that tries to get rid of the people who are already there and replace them with new people, usually your nation's people. So that's the settler colonial piece. And again, it's a lot like what I described towards the top of this conversation. Sin eaters, of course, is a religious term, right? It refers to a folk Christian tradition, usually where somebody well-to-do, when they had a relative die, would go through a sort of ritual where they put a piece of bread or something on their corpse to absorb the sins, and then they bring in somebody, usually a lower class outsider, to come and eat the bread, and then to kind of take the sins of the dead unto themselves. So it's sort of a notion, it's a way of transferring the sins of the dead into some poor schmo who then has to live with them, and hopefully that speeds the dead person's way into heaven, right? And I'm especially kind of picking on that to refer a little bit to what Jonathan brought up, this kind of question of bad apples. Because over time, as historians, we're first trying to write the history of the Pacific Northwest and dealing with a legacy of a horrific period of violence, of genocide, of sexual violence, of mass killings of children, right? One of the techniques that they used to try and make that not the story of the Northwest was to isolate it to a few bad apples, right? To turn them into the people who did all the bad things, right? If a bad thing happened, it was transient gold miners passing through. And so the notion of settler colonial sin eaters is saying they're using those people on the fringes of society, some of whom did do horrific things, right? And blaming everything that society did on that fringe, trying to use them as the sin eaters for the Northwest or the sin eaters for America, so that we can go on with the vision of innocence that says, well, but the mainstream is good, right? It's just a few bad apples.
Are there kind of prime examples of sin eaters that might illustrate this concept? Is there like one that's like, this is really what I'm hitting at?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the only mass killings that the early historians couldn't write out was something known as the Lupton Massacre. It's a mass killing by a guy named Lupton of native non-combatants, of civilians who'd been promised peace. And because he promised these guys peace, and then he went to the local tavern in Jacksonville, Oregon, and said, hey, I promised them peace. Now we can massacre them while they're off their guard. He got a bunch of guys together. They went out in the middle of the night and they murdered dozens of people. And it's famous because the counterattack from those groups kicked off part of the war, brought the federal government in, and a federal investigation was trying to figure out what had happened, right? So this is the one that made national news. There's lots of other mass killings that don't. This is one that makes national news. So when historians were trying to tell a heroic story of Oregon, they couldn't just cut out the Lupton Massacre, because back then, people would have heard of it. These days, almost no one's heard of it, even in Oregon and Washington. But back then, very famous. And so when they were doing that, they tried to separate it out from the rest of the history of Southern Oregon. This guy, James Lupton, he'd just been elected the delegate for Southern Oregon, right? He was an elected leader. He just won that election. As historians were writing about him, they turned him into a packer. They said, yeah, he's some outsider who does mule driving, right? They didn't mention that, he's a popularly elected. He's one of the most famous guys in Southern Oregon, but they turn him into this kind of lower class outsider to try and remove him from the mainstream of the good and noble pioneers. They talk about it as rogues and honest men. And so the honest men are the mainstream and he's a rogue, even though, again, he just won a popular election. And they'll do similar things elsewhere, right? It was normal to brag about doing sexual violence in the elections of Southern Oregon. That's part of how you get men's votes, right? And that routinely gets cut out as soon as people start writing histories, because that's not the sort of thing that you want in there. You say, no. If there was sexual violence, it was lower class gold miners who weren't even from around here, right? They're from California. Similarly, when Oregonians want to blame something on the fringe, they say, oh, it's those dirty Californians that are coming up from the north, right? They're not real Oregonians. When Californians in the same period want to blame something on the fringe, they say, oh, it's those Oregonians coming south. And frequently, it's the same guys, right? They're Oregonians when they're in California, or they're Californians when they're in Oregon, because they both want them to be outsiders.
Well, I mean, interstate conflict feels like it continues on even to this day. That's kind of interesting to see how like far back into the past that actually goes. And
it's extra strange because in this period, both Oregonians and Californians, if they're Euro-Americans, they've been there like 3 years, right? They're not Oregonians or Californians. None of them are from around there, right? They're all coming from elsewhere, and yet they're trying to imbue this natural Oregonianness or Californianness to try and create
all the good people moved to Oregon, right? So all the crazy people moved to California.
All the good people moved to Canada, Seth.
Yeah, sure.
But
what was that story you told about Vancouver?
has a long tradition of saying that, yes, all the literate people moved to Oregon and the one who couldn't read moved to California. And it's also true that in British Columbia, there's a long tradition of pretending that the kinds of horrific wars that happened down south didn't happen up there. Or when they did, it was
Marc.
definitely the
Heard that,
Americans.
So I'm always taunting Seth that Canada's better than America, and I hate that you're here as an expert to refute all of that, Marc. Why would you do this to me?
Don't worry,
I don't want to
nearly
fix
as
my
much
own
Canadian
past.
history. I can only poke at the edges.
There is no
but...
Canadian history. It's those few episodes. I mean, it's funny to me that when I was a youth minister, I'm going to take us on a tangent, that my students would always say, man, American history is so much more interesting than Canadian history. And I was just like, well, that's because we had a lot more wars. So I suppose that makes it more interesting, but...
I'm going to stand up for Jonathan here and say there's lots of wonderful Canadian history, and my colleagues in Canada do a great job. And part of why we struggle with it in the U.S. is that we don't have it on our map of where we do history classes, right? The Commonwealth nations tend to routinely get cut out. We have Europe, we have Africa, we have Latin America, we have Asia. We don't have anything for Canada or Australia.
Take that, Seth. Take that. Yeah, he fights for both sides.
Before I get us too far off sides, I want to talk about this idea of everyday violence. It's another big thing that you really emphasize, and you talk about that happening. Like there's the formal wars, declarations of wars, but everyday violence seems to be something more than that. Can you tell us a little bit about what this is?
Yeah, so I think there's a norm in military histories that is only sometimes appropriate, where you start your history at the start of a war, you end your history when a peace treaty is signed, right? And I think that can create the impression that that's all of the period of violence. And of course, the starts of wars are always incredibly messy. There's almost no war where we all agree on exactly when it starts. Even the very famous ones like World War II, we do not agree on when World War II started, right? We don't as professionals. We certainly don't as everyday people, right? There's lots of places you can put it depending on what starts to count as World War II, right? But it's especially true when it's wars that are within regions where both groups are already living, right? And so one of the things I'm trying to underline is that the kind of technical names that have been put onto the wars, which I view as all part of the same war on Ilahee, things like the Yakima War, things like the Walla Walla War, or the Cayuse War, right? They've been given these limited scopes somewhat artificially. There was violence beforehand leading up to them, and then even after a war is over and a peace treaty is signed and the U.S. has promised that the violence will stop, the violence doesn't necessarily stop. And for many of the people in this period, in a period where a lot of those wars were prosecuted not by kind of regular professional troops, but by quote unquote volunteers, by essentially a bunch of guys with guns who got together, called themselves an army, gave themselves ranks, and then went and shot nearby native people, they didn't necessarily stop doing that when there was no longer a war on, right? There's a few examples I might pull to. There's former volunteer soldiers who then turned into lynch mobs, right, in later years. And when they narrated their own lives, they viewed there to be a very normal connection between the time they shot people during war and how they would lynch people on the weekends in the decades that followed. I think there's examples from law enforcement, right, where there's sheriffs who talked a little bit about being involved in the wars and then talked about how after the wars, if they ever ran into the murdered body of a native person, they would just kind of automatically hide it because probably they were murdered by a settler, and the default position was, well, we always let settlers get away with murder, right? And so to try and get rid of these neat barriers and kind of pay attention to the ongoing violence of colonialism past the formal wars, some of which was still genocidal, right? We often associate genocide exclusively with wars, and I'd say we tend to do that in the courts as well. But nothing in the legal definition of genocide says there has to be a war on. And frequently genocide is inflicted against people within one's own nation, right? And many of those killings in the 1870s and 1880s, if they're done with the intent to exterminate a group in whole or in part, and some of them were hoping to kick off a broader mass killing, that's still part of the story of genocide.
Well, it's interesting that you contrast this legal versus, kind of everyday, because part of the thing you do talk about in your book is how the law and the legal system were used to sort of cover over and legitimate genocide. Can you explain a bit how that worked?
Sure. So there's a quote I draw, I was able to find deep in a Catholic archive from a Yakima leader named Kamakian, where he says, they hang us without knowing whether we are right or wrong, and yet there is no place or time when they would hang a white person. I'm slightly paraphrasing, and also it's through two translations. But there is a norm in this period where if any native person does violence against Euro-Americans for any reason, right, there's an overwhelming response. Sometimes legal, sometimes extra-legal, frequently both, right? There is a norm where if you are suspected of harming a Euro-American, you will be put on trial for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then you will be killed. There's also a norm of almost never trying Euro-Americans who do violence against native people. There's been some kind of misconceptions. If you look just at the trial records, you'll see occasional trials, right? But A, those are a tiny proportion of the actual crimes, and B, the kinds of punishments that are inflicted are completely different, right? A native person will be put to death if they are found to have harmed a white person most of the time. A white person who is found to have murdered a native person gets like a couple months in jail that they may or may not have served, right? And it was routine to even try to avoid that, right? It was routine for sheriffs or for soldiers to push back against any kinds of consequences. And when you have that, you create a culture of impunity, right? One of the things I try to underline, again, in almost any violent space, colonial, genocidal, whatever, right, the number of direct perpetrators is not the majority, right? But those perpetrators know that when they can kill, and the entire legal apparatus of the state will back them up, right? That they will not face criminal consequences from their own nation. And if there's an attempt from the native nation of the person whom they've killed to try and exact legal consequences, they have a whole legal system, an army, and potentially a mob that will back them up to prevent them from facing any consequences. And that incentivizes racists and thieves to murder freely, knowing that they can get away with it.
So I'd like to pivot us a little bit at this dark moment because we are a religious podcast, and we really haven't talked about religiosity so far in this. Can you tell us a little bit about what role religion did play in all of this conflict?
Yeah. So there are genocides in history that are primarily kind of have some religious origins. I'd say even those genocides, often there's some question about the comparative role of religion versus material circumstances, right? When there is a war of religion that also enriches the people who wage it, there's sort of an open question of how much of this is faith justifying versus how much of this is faith driven, right? And I think there's elements of that in the Pacific Northwest as well. I'll be frank, I found less kind of use of religiosity as a justification in the period than I was initially expecting, right? You'll certainly see it, but it's not the primary motivator people cite in the 1850s and 1860s. You do see it brought up more in later decades. So I'd say one of the main roles that it plays is in sort of after the fact justifications or smoothing out, right? There's a letter I found from a bunch of bishops proclaiming that there had never been any war crimes committed by American troops or by the governor of Washington, when he'd definitely done tons of war crimes and lies and things, right? So that kind of justificatory, right, giving weight and moral cover to figures, I think, was the main place you'll see it in the period. After the period, you see more of kind of a narrative of, oh, well, we had to do this, right, for the sake of God and country. Right. So you see more of that a little bit later as part of kind of after the fact justification, especially as people get more and more vexed by people claiming that they came and killed people and took their land because they wanted the land. Right. They really want a different narrative. So they make it about nationalism and religion, usually in that order. I'd also say it tends, part of the distorted history that I'm pushing against comes from, I think, a genuine place of curiosity and religious hope, where a lot of the earlier records we have that are written down of Native communities come from missionaries. And so there is a tendency among all historians of all stripes to kind of overestimate the importance of wherever we get our records from, right? So we have constant struggles in the history of the Pacific Northwest of kind of talking about the legacy and meaning of the missionaries, and those are important, right? But I think sometimes those get more kind of explanatory weight of the bigger picture than maybe they should, because they're the records that we're so used to going to, and they're these often quite detailed written records in a way we don't get elsewhere, right? We have to weave out of cobwebs when we're using pioneer records, whereas the depth and scale of missionary records makes it a little bit easier.
It's interesting. I was kind of preparing to get slaughtered there and, expecting religion to just, you're not excusing it at all.
We're not as bad. We're not as bad. No.
No, I mean, um, are there instances where religion is the motivating factor and driver, even if they're not as systematic as we might have expected?
So I think, I mean, certainly broadly, absolutely. I think the number of instances where that's provably the primary factor, as opposed to land hunger, or as it was called at the time, manifest destiny, are relatively small, right? I think there are some, and certainly I think it's easy to make the case that the norms of a majority of Christian denominations in this period, of presuming that Christianity belongs to white people, and that therefore white people should be in charge of everything, right? Which is pretty common across a great number of denominations in the mid 1800s in America and elsewhere, right? I'm certain that helped people do the kind of mental journey that leads them to, it is okay to kill this person and take their stuff because they're different from me, right? That one of the modes of difference was religion. But I'd say, again, it's often religion expressed as racism rather than religion expressed as something else, right? And I'd say where I see religious figures kind of more directly involved in the war, it's often more coming from a place of colonization than coming from a place of faith justification, right? And certainly there are multiple missionaries, probably most famously or infamously Marcus Whitman, who became sort of a totemic figure in the Northwest because he was one of the first Americans killed by Native people after a long period of theft and accusations of attempted murder, right? He thought of his mission as, it started as, I'm here to spread Christianity to Native people with all of the negatives and positives that comes with that, and pretty quickly transferred to, I'm here to get land and faith for white people. I don't really care about these people. They're probably all going to die, and that's okay. And his wife, Narcissa Whitman, was like, I hope they all die. I hate them, right? That's why she hit children whenever they walked by her, right? And there are other people. Jason Lee in Salem, Oregon, seems to have pretty quickly switched to doing land speculation and hoping to, minister mostly to newcomers from America rather than his supposed mission of attempting to spread Christianity among local Native nations. But again, it's sort of a little bit more of an aside than a main driver in this space. And I think that's true more often than we might be comfortable with, right? And again, maybe that's just my take as a somewhat materialist historian. But, I think greed is often a pretty primary motivator for a lot of this violence. And so often the role of religion is in justifying or sanctifying or transmuting that greed into something that you're more comfortable living with within yourself.
That's really interesting because we expect the materialist historian to reject traditional hagiographic religious narratives where it's like God was moving. But in some ways, the materialist rejects that ideas have that much value in history.
Ideas have enormous value in history, but don't underestimate greed.
Yeah. Sorry, Seth, you were about to speak. Go ahead.
Yeah. Somewhat, idealism, materialism. He'll find a higher Hegelian synthesis between the two. See what I did there, John? I'm curious that you earlier mentioned that not everyone justified these acts, and that was cool. But I want to kind of return to that now that we're in talking about the religion factor. Were there any bright shining stars, like people who, for religious reasons, opposed what was going on to the Native Americans?
Yeah, there are a couple. Not as many as I would have liked to have found, but there are a couple. I was unexpectedly able to partially rehabilitate a man named Samuel Parker, who I think had been read a little bit casually as perhaps supporting the horrors that the Americans had done. And when I went back and looked at his actual paper, he's like, yeah, the Americans do this, and that's bad. I don't understand why they do that, right? He has this honestly quite stirring thing of like, God made them for this country. What right do we have to take it, right? And he was denied a mission. And I am curious if part of why he was denied a mission is maybe his politics were a little bit too radical. There's a Catholic priest, Father Pandosi, who was, culturally very tenured, right? He certainly believed in a certain level of European supremacy, but he took seriously that his job was to try and uplift and support the Yakama Nation, whose mission was to during the war on Ilahee. And he, at times, risked his life, right, to be honest with them about what the Americans were doing. It probably helped that he wasn't American, right, about what the Americans were doing, right? He's part of how they knew what the Americans were planning for their country. And he seems to have acted as in good faith, trying to negotiate and keep them from the war that was being inflicted on them. I think the religious figure who I would really underline, though, was just kind of an everyday British American. He's a man named John Beeson, who wrote self-published a book called A Plea for the Indians, which, again, culturally tenured, is an interesting read, right? A very good source for what was going on in Southern Oregon. And he seems to have just kind of been an everyday farming guy, but his conception of Christian faith was that it's not okay to murder people and take their stuff, right? That all human beings are under God the same, right? And so, he adds a bunch of cultural bigotry, sure, whatever, but like he fundamentally just rejected the notion, normal among his neighbors, that Native people didn't deserve to live and have lives and have property and have faith the same as anyone else. And he complained about it loudly enough that he got ran out of town, right? When he started telling the world about the horrors that were going on in Southern Oregon, they threatened to, quote, kill him like an Indian if he stayed. And so he had to flee his family, and he never fully reconciled with them. And he spent the last years of his life pleading, sometimes in vain, perhaps sometimes not, with the rest of Americans, trying to get them to accept that Native people were people like anyone else under God's grace. And, always seemed a bit puzzled as to why other people weren't more like him, right? To him, it just seemed like a natural extension of his faith, and he didn't understand how so many other people couldn't see the shared humanity. So I think he's the one I'd stress most, in part because he is just a normal guy, right? An upstander whose faith and life leads him to go, we shouldn't be doing this, right? And then to try and do something about it.
Well, thank you for that kind of picture of sort of American colonial religion. I wonder if we might now pivot a little bit to ask a bit about the religion that was already here before the Europeans got here and brought ours. I know that Native communities are very complex and diverse, and they're not monoliths, but is it still possible to give a sense of some of the common traits that tended to appear in Native religion? Is there a sense of a few things that are key in that, even if they're not everywhere all the same?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to be cautious here, right? Both, I am not a Native person, and I'm a historian of violence more than I am of religion, but I can cautiously suggest a few pretty common norms among a majority of Native religions. I'd say one of them, it's often very place-based, right? That there are particular sacred places, and within that place base, there's sacred sets of relations, both between people and with other than human entities, beings, landscapes, etc. Right? So there's a kind of a broad norm that you have reciprocal obligations to do certain things in certain places, but also reciprocal obligations with rivers, with animals, with plants. Right? That's your kind of one's faith puts one is in part of a set of relationships that go in both directions. Right? And I bring up that go in both directions. Right? Again, a lot of modern and historical Native claims to place are predicated in part on we have a duty to this place and it has a duty to us, and so we have to maintain that. And one of the kinds of stories where I can't share the details, but I've heard some stories that aren't for the full public that I can share in a broad sense, right? Where some of the communities that survived this period of genocide, they credit part of their survival in kind of some of their usual and accustomed places, fulfilling their obligation by keeping them hidden at the time when genocidaires were roaming, right? That they were able to survive as well as they did because they were sheltered by the lands with which they had a relationship. And so part of their duty to those lands is kind of repaying and renewing that reciprocal bond.
So again, I'm going to pick up on this, and I know you're not an expert in this, but I'm just kind of curious if you know much about Native American religiosity today.
Yeah, so I know bits and pieces. A slight majority of people who identify as Indigenous also identify as Christian. Exactly how large a majority depends, because both of those terms, both Indigenous and Christian, have contested boundaries, because what term does not, right? I would say for many of those people, they view Christianity and traditional Native practices as potentially harmonious, right? Where, to argue that some Native traditions have a tradition of a great spirit and say, there's the great spirit here is similar to the other ones, right? And certainly to say that, you can do a traditional dance in traditional language and have that be a form of worship that is appropriate in a Christian context, right? There are other practitioners of traditional religions who say absolutely not, right? No, we have our own religion. It has nothing to do with this imported faith, right? And I'm not remotely going to try and take a side on any of those discussions and debates. I'd say there is a long and famously damaging legacy of missions that attempt to destroy Native culture along with Native religions, right? Who have asserted, I'd say, in violation of most scriptural traditions, that like you can't be Christian and also speak your own language or dress in your own clothing, which is not in keeping with most traditions of how those actually go. Again, the Bible's not in English originally, right? And there's a smaller but still present set of syncretic traditions trying to find common ground between traditional practice and at least some aspects of Christianity.
Well, kind of following up on that a little bit, were there religious narratives and language and stories used by Native communities to help frame and make sense of the coming of white settlers? Are they making sense of this within a religious framework? And I mean, is this eschatological? Is this the apocalypse? How are they making sense of what's happening, and what role does religion play in that?
So yes is the short answer. I'd also say often the evidence is tricky, especially for outsiders, right? And I want to be respectful that there are many narratives that are not for people who are not part of the community that I don't know, and a few that I do know that aren't for sharing, right? And there's particularly some questions with the evidence because some of the earliest written records we have where ethnographers would go out to Native nations and try and get those kinds of stories, they were coming looking for a particular story, right? So they wanted a story of apocalypse because they wanted a story where Native nations were in the past tense, right? So there's some bad info out there because they would dig for the story until they got it. And you can see that in some of their notes. A story I would kind of specifically like to connect to that I think is, if not emblematic of the whole, one that I've certainly seen versions of elsewhere. There's a Squamish story. Squamish are kind of BC area, but also a little bit into what's now Washington, where their framing of the coming of white people was in a series of disasters that they suffered through and survived, right? So they talked about, they have their kind of oral histories includes, we've suffered either 4 or 5, depending on the tradition, right? Great calamities, right? There were floods, there were fires. I'm missing the third one. And then there was smallpox, and then sometimes there's a separate one, and then there's a bunch of these invaders, right? And so on the one hand, that's putting it in these kind of, sort of religious or cosmic terms, right? And often it was visited upon us because we turned away from tradition, right? The fires came because we turned away from the tradition, the smallpox came, and all these invaders came, right? But it's also a narrative of we survived these, right? We survived the fire, we survived the flood, we survived the smallpox, and we're going to survive this invasion, right? And I'll certainly, sometimes in some religious context, there is a notion of, we've been here a lot longer and we'll still be here even if the current nations go away, right? We have a faith tradition that goes back centuries, right? And will go centuries into the future.
You mentioned smallpox, and it brought up something we haven't really talked about so far, which is the role of disease. You see some of these astronomical figures come out about like the number of natives that died by disease. And I'm just curious, could you speak a little bit to that? And honestly, a curiosity I've always had is, how do they determine these numbers? Are you aware of how they're able to determine the number of natives who were killed off by diseases introduced by Western settlers?
Yeah, so it's super hard, which is part of why those numbers vary so much, right? Because usually the kind of conventional thing we use to determine deaths from disease are by looking at censuses, right? And you only get censuses with large states. And up here, you don't have a whole lot of large states, right? So the typical number that we cite these days is roughly 90% from smallpox or other diseases at some point. But that is very much guesswork based on what we know about pre-Columbian populations, about populations before European arrival, and what we know about the counts from populations we have once we have censuses, which is usually after the wars, right? And the ones in the Northwest, again, there's a very skilled anthropologist who did his best named Robert Boyd. But if you dig into the notes of that book deeply enough, it's educated guesswork. And a lot of it is like, they said lots. We have a few sites that suggest this many people in this kind of site. maybe here's a guess on how many of those lots would be, but we really don't have good numbers. And I'd say we have a couple of intensifying factors that make the numbers in the Pacific Northwest particularly tough to measure. We have a couple of different epidemics that sometimes get smushed together in memory, right? We have an epidemic in the late 1700s, and we have one in the 1830s, 1840s. We have a problem of not having great population numbers. The older assumptions was that you tend not to get large population numbers without agriculture. We've disproven that. We know there were very large population sites without kind of organized formal agriculture, but we don't know how many there were. The places where we got early Americans were burial grounds first, right? So the islands in which they landed were where people put their dead. So we don't know if the counts of the dead that he was using are accurate or if they're counting the dead of generations. And there's the thing that I underline, which is that there's a norm of treating killings in wars as rounding errors. And I'd say as we are trying to track and reconfigure these histories of disease, there's no question disease killed huge numbers of people, right? It's going to be somewhere in the 80 to 90% range. But it's also the case that disease doesn't kill everybody, right? And one of the things the narrative of disease has been used for is to do a new version of the old empty land story, right? To try and make it about, oh, well, disease killed everybody and then white people showed up and then the land was empty. And that manifestly was not true. There was no empty land even after disease. Again, we've got a Canadian on the podcast, right? One of the things that I tried to do to make sense of this with my students is if 90% of the population of North Dakota died, that wouldn't mean Canada could just grab North Dakota, right? And say, oh, it's ours now because 90% of you are gone, right? That's not how we talk about land or family or property rights or anything else in any other context. So I think it's useful to think about when we think about how invaders had the power to do this. There's no question the reason why those wars were as effective as they were by the invaders was because they were wars on nations that had been severely weakened by epidemic disease. But it's also important we don't treat the wars as the rounding error, right? And we don't actually know what percentage of people died from disease versus inflicted malnutrition versus direct deaths. And even some of those deaths from disease are also deaths from other things, right? When we talk about deaths from disease in internment camps, for example, those are deaths from disease, but they're also the inflicting of conditions of life that will bring about destruction. One of the things under genocide.
So we're getting close to the end of the time, but a couple more questions. One that I really want to ask you. Your book, we've touched on basically just a little bit of it. You really dive into a lot of these details in here, in the book. But I want to ask if you could ensure that if one historical episode or one aspect of your book is heard, which maybe one you haven't touched on so far, what would that be?
So there's a small story that I think can stand in for a lot of the rest of it. It's about a Klickitat native farmer named Dick Johnson, who really attempted to follow what was laid out as the colonial rules, right? The kind of classic claim of colonialism is that if you change your lives, right, if you become farmers alongside white people, right, that's how we'll find a future together. And Dick Johnson, again, he's a Klickitat. He moves to Southern Oregon. He marries a local indigenous woman who's Umpqua, right? He starts a prosperous farm in the European style, right? He tries to maintain friendships with his neighbors. And then over time, as new people come in, they take his land, right? They want his land. They take it because under the legal codes of Oregon, he cannot get land claims put through officially. He tries and tries and tries to hold on to his land for his family peaceably, and eventually he is murdered by vigilantes. And despite the best efforts of his family, there is no justice for those murders. So I think that's one piece of it. I also, part of that story that I would stress as part of the survival piece, his relative, a guy, I only know his name is Jim, I hope to find his last name someday if he has one, right? Who interrupted the vigilantes partway through the murder of his family. Right, so they were probably there to kill everybody. This one guy rode up, and these vigilantes, again, they're murderers, but they're also cowards, right? They were kind of surprised by a guy who had a gun who rode up, and he spent the night. He got shot by them, and then he went in and grabbed his gun, and they ran away, and he spent the night watching over his family, the wounded, the dead, and the living, in a long night with a piece of saddle over his wound so that he could keep them alive. And to me, that's both a story of the depth of the violence, right? That these vigilantes essentially weren't punished, right? They didn't profit quite as much off the murder as they'd hoped to, but they essentially weren't punished. But also a story of this survival. I think about this man trying to keep the rest of his family alive as he bleeds in the night, and succeeding, right? That they didn't get everybody, right? And I think there's ways in which that's a metonym for some of the broader struggles and evils that I talk about elsewhere in the book.
Thank you so much, Marc. This has been a very challenging conversation, and it raises a lot of other questions. But if people want to know more about this, if this has really piqued their curiosity, where can they get their book? Where can they hear more from you? Do you have a website? Anything you want to pitch here at the end?
Yeah, so I'd say I mostly just have the book that Jonathan is very kindly holding up, right? The War on Ilahee. If you're listening to this podcast in the present, FAL 25 will get you a discount on it. So, go ahead and have that. I've published a few articles. If you want to get a sampling first, my article Pioneer Problems, talking about the word pioneer and how it originally meant killer, is available for free on the internet. The journal has been kind enough to make that available for everybody, at least this year. So you can check that out for free, kind of get a sense of some of what I'm talking about. And I'd also encourage people, make sure you look at sources from Native people themselves.